So, Excellencies, dear colleagues, friends, welcome to this conversation on recovering from COVID-19, the role of sustainable finance to end modern slavery and human trafficking. My name is Daniel Telesclove. I'm the newly appointed Director of Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, the FAST initiative, which is based at the United Nations University's Center for Policy Research in New York. Also known as the Liechtenstein Initiative, this is a multi-stakeholder initiative that works to mobilize the financial sector against modern slavery and human trafficking. I'm very pleased to be joined here by a number of colleagues, many of them former financial sector commissioners, but I would like to start with two short introductory welcome statements at ministerial level. And I kindly ask my colleague Anthony Dursey to start with the video of Minister Hasler, former Minister of Liechtenstein, Minister Gonzalo Laya, former Minister of Spain. Please.
Excellencies, dear colleague, it's an honor to welcome you at this high-level political forum event on the role of sustainable finance to end modern slavery and human trafficking, which relates directly to the theme of this year's HLPF. Sustainable and resilient recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic that promotes the economic, social and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. Target 8.7 on the 2030 agenda calls for concrete actions to end modern slavery and human trafficking. The COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the drivers of modern slavery and human trafficking, including growing poverty and economic inequality. Women and girls who are already disproportionately affected by modern slavery will find themselves even more vulnerable as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, as many are forced to drop out of school early, are sent to work in exploitative conditions, or are married off at an early age. Widespread school closures in response to the threat of COVID-19 also renders children, in particular school-aged girls, even more susceptible to exploitation. The COVID-19 pandemic is therefore a call on all of us to do our part to build back better, including redoubling our efforts to end modern slavery and human trafficking. Part of this should include an active effort to leverage the crucial role played by the financial sector in ending these exploitative practices. This is why, together with Australia, the Netherlands, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, United Nations University, and private sector's partners in Liechtenstein, we support the Financed Against Slavery and Trafficking initiative, in short, FAST. FAST aims to engage the financial sector to tackle trafficking and slavery. It offers financial actors a practical blueprint to promote sustainable and innovative financing, responsible lending and investment, and compliance and regulation. Following the money can not only lead us to the perpetrators, but also deny them the resources they need to commit such crimes. Financial institutions may handle funds generated by human trafficking and modern slavery. They may invest wittingly or unwittingly in businesses relying on forced labor. And they risk violating a variety of existing laws in doing so, especially in the areas of anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. Excellencies, dear colleagues, the role of the financial sector in the fight against slavery and trafficking is on paramount importance. 73 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, which provided for the abolition of slavery, today's reality still shows shocking levels of slavery and trafficking around the globe, from its most insidious to its most invisible expressions. This is simply unacceptable. It is an outrageous assault on human dignity, but it is also a disturbingly profitable form of organized crime, generating tens of billions of US dollars in revenue each year. This shocking state of affairs requires new approaches to end slavery and trafficking. Integrating sustainable finance into our collective toolbox, such as increased attention to environmental, social, and governance factors, can create new pathways for investment to reverse destructive trends. In the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have a responsibility to do our part to build back better, not only by responding to the drivers and exacerbators of modern slavery and human trafficking, but by reckoning with the legacies and lessons of past connections between development and slavery. At the same time, it is important to remember financial inclusion can be a major means to prevent vulnerability in its first place. Excellencies, dear colleagues, the challenges we face seem daunting, but the 2030 Agenda provides us with a framework to make our world socially, economically, and environmentally more sustainable, with the fight against modern slavery and human trafficking as a key component. The FAST initiative not only contributes to the realization of SDG 8, but also 5, 16, 17, as well as others. And it responds to call from the Security Council and the General Assembly to join forces with relevant actors in the fight against these abhorrent crimes. The interest and expertise of Liechtenstein's Financial Center led to the launch of the FAST initiative as an international PPP, very much in line with the calls from the Security Council and the framework offered by the 2030 Agenda. We are looking to forge new partnerships, in particular with other governments and financial institutions themselves. In this regard, the HLPF will remain a key forum, while we also place special focus on regional initiatives with the help of our partners. With the FAST initiative, we have created high expectations, but I am positive that with your help, we will be able to live up to them. Thank you very much.
Modern slavery and human trafficking have been on the rise for over a decade now. Even before the pandemic, 40 million people were subject to these forms of exploitation, according to conservative estimates. Today, global economies and labor markets are struggling to recover from the severe impact of COVID-19. The numbers of vulnerable people have spiked across the globe. An increase in human trafficking will follow suit. Once again, women and girls will be disproportionately affected. For every 10 victims of trafficking detected worldwide, 5 are women and 2 are girls. The risk of exploitation is particularly high for migrants, as well as for women working in the informal economy. Likewise, child labor continues to grow. A report from the International Labour Organization and UNICEF just last month found that child labor victims have risen to 160 million at the beginning of this year. What can we do? How can we address these major challenges? I would like to congratulate Liechtenstein for hosting the side event. that will allow us to focus on the role of sustainable finance, which is a key element to end modern slavery and human trafficking. Governments are increasingly coming together with the private sector to take collective action, following the UN guiding principles on business and human rights laid out 10 years ago. The FAST initiative is a testament to that. This is a transnational crime, and as such, it requires a comprehensive approach, combining the efforts of countries of origin, transit, and destination, together with relevant stakeholders such as the financial sector. Financial flows, together with financial technology, can help us detect and disrupt criminal networks, shedding light on their profits. Regulators can work together to keep strengthening anti-money laundering and corporate reporting requirements. The financial system can also foster effective action, especially by business, in order to identify and mitigate risks in their value chains. The COVID-19 crisis has exposed the vulnerabilities of global supply chains with its tangible human costs. But the pandemic has also given us an opportunity to identify and implement strategies to create more resilient systems. I'm sure the panel today will elaborate on this and other relevant topics. Now is a crucial time to lay the foundations of an inclusive global economy in order to meet the goals of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. I wish you the best of luck in your discussions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good, thank you very much for both interventions. This is setting the stage for our panel discussion, but also the discussion we will be having with you. Let me just add that the statement of Minister González Laya was recorded last Thursday. There has been a government reshuffle in Spain over the weekend, but I'm sure that nothing will change in the statement, the important statement that she made. COVID-19 has thrown millions of people out of work. It threatens to make them vulnerable to exactly the kind of coercion that leads to modern slavery and human trafficking. We are concerned that our efforts to enhance financial inclusion may have been less effective during the pandemic, when bank tellers were closed and the most vulnerable ones were not in a position to go through sophisticated digital onboarding processes. Our tools to combat modern slavery and human trafficking may also have failed to generate the desired outcomes during the pandemic. Let me just give you an example. We have been investing a good amount of work to convince financial institutions to screen their transactions for potential suspicious activity relating to those crimes. However, when governments made stimulus packages available to businesses, they asked banks to disperse these huge amounts of money as soon as possible, possibly making it harder for financial institutions to conduct due diligence the way they have done it before the outbreak of the pandemic. On the other hand, these government stimulus packages may also be an opportunity if they ask the recipients to commit also to social standards. I'm sure that we will be looking deeper into these issues in the upcoming 90 minutes, and I'm delighted to be joined here by 4 dedicated experts and friends today. Before I turn to them, let me remind you that you are invited to submit questions using the Q&A facility on the bottom right of your screen. We will monitor incoming questions and hopefully be able to take as many as possible of them at the end of the panelists' interventions. So let me now start with Fiona Reynolds. Fiona is the CEO of the UN-backed Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI. Responsible investment network with over 2,700 members and more than $100 trillion under management. Fiona was also the chair of the Financial Sector Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking that laid the fundament for what we call the FAST Blueprint. Fiona, it's a pleasure to have you here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Daniel, and hi everyone. It's great to have the opportunity to be here to speak with you today. And I really hope that wherever you are in the world watching this, that you are safe and well. So I've been asked to speak to you about the role that COVID-19 is playing really in fostering the increase in focus and demand for sustainable investment, and how the response of the investment community to building back better is developing, with a particular focus on social issues, on human capital, but also on issues such as modern slavery and human trafficking, on human rights more generally. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the PRI, or the Principles for Responsible Investment, we represent the responsible investment community. So now we have more than 4,000 signatories to our 6 principles, and they represent 121 trillion US in assets under management. And as Daniel said, in addition to being the CEO of the PRI, it was really my pleasure to serve as the chair of the commission into the role looking at finance and addressing modern slavery and human trafficking. And I'm really proud of the report, the blueprint that we put out, and the work that then has stemmed from it. And I'd encourage you all to read it. So at the PRI, given that we're the biggest responsible investment organisation, we've really seen that over the past decade that investors' understanding of both environmental and governance indicators, or the E and the G in ESG, and their materiality has improved. And investors have moved to integrate these indicators into their risk analysis and into their screening. Meanwhile, however, social performance considerations, or the S issues, have often been dismissed as either immaterial or a lesser priority because of the incorrect perception from investors that they present a lower risk to revenue streams, or are less likely to be subject to regulatory action or to punitive measures. But I think that COVID-19 has shown people who sort of doubted the importance of social issues. They've shown us really the interconnectedness of issues, and they've really demonstrated the materiality of social or human rights issues. So S issues are really starting to be no longer sort of considered to be the poor cousin in the ESG family. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a huge amount of work still to be done. So I think COVID-19 is also a real example to governments, to business, and to investors of the fact that without healthy people and without a healthy planet, there can be no healthy economy. All of these things must go together. It's also a reminder that for the financial system to serve its intended purpose, that people need to be at the heart of the way investments are conducted, and that it's not okay to make money by exploiting people or exploiting the planet. Now, this includes, of course, the issues of supply chain risk, which is a big issue for investors, and it's obviously a big risk to workers and communities in those supply chains. So while many investors take a very systematic approach at actively addressing supply chain issues, where we see a lot of human rights violations, not enough investors have really embedded them in their investment process in a really deep and meaningful way. Yet investors have leverage. They have leverage with the companies that they invest in, and they need to use it by undertaking far more due diligence of companies, and of asking those companies and demanding to understand how they investigate their supply chains for human rights abuses, for modern slavery and human trafficking cases. As we know, and as has already been talked about, COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the most vulnerable in our society. And it's brought these issues into the spotlight, and that's where they need to stay. We all need now to ensure that they are front and centre as we build a recovery that's far more green and far more inclusive than what has been here in the past. So labour markets around the world were, obviously disrupted in 2020, and this continues on a historically unprecedented scale. And the latest ILO estimates revealing a decline in working hours of around 8.8% globally in 2020, which is equivalent to 255 million full-time jobs. In addition, a joint ILO and UNICEF report estimated as a result of COVID-19, 8.9 million more children are at risk of being pushed into child labour by the end of 2022 if there aren't additional measures taken. And a recent report by the Brookings Institute estimates that as a result of COVID-19, by 2030, 588 million people could still be living in extreme poverty. And that's an additional 50 million people compared to pre-COVID-19 estimates. So as we've seen, the virus itself may not discriminate, but our socio-economic systems do. And the COVID crisis is highlighting the lack of social safety nets and worker protection is having immense negative impacts, not only on workers, not only on those in supply chains, but on markets and on the wider society. Our recovery from COVID-19 can't be built on the exploitation of the poor and the most vulnerable in society. The private sector, business, finance, and investors need to be part of the solution, and governments alone can't fund or drive the transformation we need. Frontline, essential and key workers, gig economy workers, migrant workers, tele and remote workers, and workers in the informal economy and in supply chains have had some of the most significant exposures to risk. You know, of course, the virus is going to spread when people are continuing to be faced with the choice of going to work ill or not being paid, when they live day to day, week to week, when they live hand to mouth. And the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the labour market has only solidified the link between business and human rights. So at the PRI, we've really tried to enforce and make it clear that any responsible investor should build their approach to addressing social issues, the S issues in ESG, on respect for human rights. That needs to be the fundamentals. So as a direct result of the blueprint for mobilising finance against slavery and trafficking, and how we thought about how investors could best incorporate the issue of modern slavery and human trafficking into the investment process, at the PRI we launched a 5-year human rights program, which we launched with a paper late last year. And our aim is to get this space moving and develop so that all investors include human rights into their investment process. The work's underpinned by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. There's good frameworks out there. We don't even need to invent new ones. Just as a way of looking at how far there is to go today, at the PRI, we've got some great signatories who do fantastic work. But until now, some of them are really using the UNGPs in a sophisticated way. But for most of our signatories, this has been voluntary. It's not a mandatory exercise. And we're only really seeing a minority of leading investors participating or reporting on human rights. So about 42% of PRI signatories mention human rights in their reporting to us. Less than 10% use the UNGPs or OECD guidelines to screen their portfolios. In terms of big collaborative engagements that the PRI does from investors to companies, over the last 5 years, we've run a number of engagements on social issues. We've had 115 investors in 5 years who have participated. If I compare that to an engagement that we're doing at the moment called Climate Action 100+, that's focused on climate change, it has 500 investors, 50 trillion in assets under management. So within the program that we're doing, we're focusing on 5 core priority areas. So embedding human rights into the investment practices, into public policy, into social data, so that there is better data, on investor reporting, so that reporting becomes mandatory within the PRI reporting framework, and on stewardship, and we're developing a big engagement on human rights as well. I'll just finish because I'm running over time. I just do want to use one great example of a group of investors who are PRI signatories who have taken the blueprint to take action and are leading on this issue. And they have an initiative called Find It, Fix It, Prevent It. It's a coalition that's supported by the PRI and is coordinated by CCLA, a big investment manager. And the group is really looking to tackle modern slavery in supply chains. They're calling for more companies to act on modern slavery and to find it, fix it, and to prevent it. and they want to see meaningful, effective action by companies. And their response starts with the focus on one clear key KPI that ultimately matters to companies. Who have you rescued from slavery? How have you found it? And it's a fantastic initiative that's going to take off around the world that investors are doing. So just to conclude, I think institutional investors, again, they have leverage. Some of them are using it, but not all of them are using it. They need to use it more effectively with companies they invest in and with governments and regulators across the globe. So I'll just finish there by saying that, we all need to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And investors can't solve this problem on their own, but they definitely have a significant role to play. So thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fiona, not only for highlighting the devastating impact COVID-19 had on, and still has, on vulnerable populations, but also explaining the interconnected nature between the ES, the S, and the G goals, and you actually can't do one and not do the other. Also, thanks for informing us about the important work PRI is doing to enshrine human rights in your processes, and to end with a positive example. I was very happy to hear how this initiative used also the blueprint. We now move on to Dawn Spicer. Dawn is the Executive Director of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. She's an attorney by profession, 28 years of experience in the area of anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. Dawn was also a member of the Financial Sector Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking. Dawn, it's great to have you with us here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. It is indeed great to be here and to discuss what's really a very serious topic. We have lots of crime everywhere, but this is a crime that goes and directly impacts, as you can tell from Fiona's presentation, the most vulnerable sectors of society. As a necessary part of addressing this crime, I'm going to focus on the importance of collaborations with financial investigations, which is an important aspect, and some risk mitigation in terms of financial transactions, which drive this process, because of course, we all know this is about money. The FAST Initiative's blueprint, goals 1 and 4 respectively, contain items that require the strengthening of financial investigations through collaboration between regulators, FIUs, and private sector actors to develop better AML CFT risk indicators for modern slavery and human trafficking, and for cooperation with financial investigators and judicial processes. Additionally, the FAST Toolkit for Financial Investigations notes a lack of coordination among law enforcement organizations as one of the challenges to investigating and prosecuting trafficking in human beings. Financial intelligence units, law enforcement agencies, and supervisors therefore need to work together to identify, monitor, and communicate the changing risk landscape and provide guidance to the private sector. Based on recent reports prepared by the Financial Action Task Force, Council of Europe, the World Economic Forum, the UNODC, and others, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to the further exploitation of vulnerable groups to human trafficking and modern slavery. This has occurred primarily through the diversion of resources from government agencies regularly engaged in detecting human trafficking cases and identifying victims of trafficking, for example, social and healthcare workers. The shutdown of workplaces, the slowdown in the economy, rising unemployment, and financial insecurity are also elements that have been added to this dilemma. FATF Recommendation 30 requires the financial investigation of money laundering and terrorist financing and predicate offenses. Modern slavery and human trafficking falls within the FATF's designated category of offenses that require financial investigations. Financial investigations cover identifying the extent of criminal networks, identifying and tracing the proceeds of crime, and developing evidence that can be used in criminal proceedings. Additionally, the FATF recommendations require, when necessary, the formation of permanent or temporary multidisciplinary groups that specialize in financial or asset investigations, and thus reinforces the need for ongoing collaboration in financial investigations. Modern slavery and human trafficking are crimes with diverse financial flows because of the many avenues that can be used to exploit vulnerable persons. It therefore requires information from various sources to fully understand the level of risk of human trafficking and to detect, investigate, and prosecute. Collaboration should not only be amongst law enforcement, financial and asset recovery units, supervisors and regulators, but also with the private sector, and specifically include financial institutions, DNFPPs, and NGOs, and of course, the victims themselves, so that timely changes can be made with regard to the money laundering, terrorist financing risk landscape, which can be shared to mitigate human trafficking and other crimes. As a transnational crime, it is important that financial intelligence generated by FIUs on modern slavery and human trafficking is shared with domestic and international competent authorities. Thus, collaboration with international stakeholders such as Egmont, FinCEN, and FinTrack as a few examples, and regionally with CARICOM Impacts, the RSS ARU, which is an asset recovery unit, and ARIN Carib is crucial. The interagency collaboration at the regional and international level facilitates more effective financial investigations, leading to prosecutions and convictions of persons for modern slavery and human trafficking. A typical human trafficking case discussed at our recent CFATF plenary meeting involved collaboration between police officers, the FIU, customs, immigration, social services, foreign law enforcement, counterparts, financial institutions, and translators. And of course, included that in that group was actually communication with the victims, understanding what they went through, the process, how they got to be there, because as I said, there are many avenues and channels of luring people and misusing them and misusing their labor and services. Given the ongoing fluidity and uncertainty associated with the pandemic, the ingredients for increased human trafficking and exploitation of workers remains high. And so risk mitigation measures that can be built into financial transactions are essential. While some of the proceeds of human trafficking may be unbanked, it is believed that most transactions flow through financial institutions as legitimate financial services businesses. The significant increase in virtual or online transactions that involve non-face-to-face encounters as a result of the pandemic also means that red flags such as high levels of cash deposits and fund transfers received from individuals and deposits and withdrawals at ATMs bear less significance in suspecting that human trafficking or modern slavery is taking place. In the area of strengthening financial investigations, the FAST Blueprint recommends the development of transaction analysis tools. As mitigating measures, financial institutions can therefore target scenarios which appear to be human trafficking related through customer profiling and their related transactional activity. The use of advanced data analytics, which builds upon keyword searches, can be used to help categorize different types of human trafficking scenarios. For example, with words such as escort service or massage parlor indicating a trafficker scenario, and travel words such as hotel, motel, or even Uber may indicate victim scenarios. This feeds into identifying suspicious transactions that involve human trafficking and the submission of detailed suspicion transaction reports to FIUs that can lead to financial investigations. The FATF paper on financial flows from human trafficking also suggests, among other things, that greater focus be placed on Hawala-type systems and their use by facilitators to ensure that there is greater traceability of the financial flows of human trafficking. The review of red flag indicators to address the increased use of online financial services and the training of persons in the financial transaction chain on the risk indicators of human trafficking and modern slavery are also good ways to mitigate the risk through financial institutions. In concluding, the important takeaway is the need for ongoing collaboration by public and private sector stakeholders and victims to facilitate financial investigations that can lead to ending the chain of misery that is caused by modern slavery and human trafficking. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for again reminding us the importance of financial investigations based on financial intelligence, and with that underlying the importance of collaborating with the private sector here, but also because we deal here with a transnational crime, to highlight the relevance of international cooperation. You were mentioning the Egmont Group. I was very happy to see that the chair of the Egmont Group is actually among us here. Hi, Henny. The Egmont Group, along with many other FIUs, some of them mentioned by Dawn, play a fundamentally important role to detect human trafficking and modern slavery in the transactions. But also thanks, Dawn, for mentioning that we have to keep being very attentive to recent changes. So red flags indicators that have been identified a few years ago may not have the same importance as they have now. So I think that's more than a valid point. Thank you very much, Dawn.
Welcome.
We now turn to James Kofi Annan. James is the founder of a non-profit, non-governmental organization in Ghana that works to protect children's rights and end child trafficking. James was trafficked when he was 6 years old, and he spent 7 years there in modern slavery. He managed to escape, returned to his home, and put himself through school. Later, while working as a bank manager, James saved up money to start Challenging Heights, with the intent to prevent more children from going through what he did and to rescue the children still working on Lake Volta. James was also a member of the Financial Sector Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking. James, great to have you with us, and please, the floor is yours for the next minutes. I think you are unmuted. You are muted, James. Here we are.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Daniel, and great to see you again. And good everyone. Fiona, it's nice seeing you again. I think the last time we met was in France when we attended the PRI conference. Is it France or somewhere in Europe? But it's great always listening to you speak about the issues that you work on. And I'm pleased to say that you have taken a portion of some of the issues that I think is very important to have our audience listen to. And that is the issue of increased vulnerability and the worsening numbers of children who have become victims of child labor and child trafficking. So quite easier now. I'll just look at the how COVID-19 is impacting on victims, on survivors, and how we can build sustainably with them. When we look at what has happened, especially in our parts of the world, we see that a lot of our economy is dependent on person to person and not so much of huge technology injection as far as the
James, I'm afraid you're breaking up occasionally.
Is concerned. So right when
James, you're breaking up occasionally.
Internet.
James, I suggest that can you please try maybe to switch off your video camera, because you're breaking up, and that may improve the audio.
Yes, it's the internet I'm sorry. Is it better now?
Try again.
Hello? Is it better now?
James, try again. I think we
Hello,
can
Daniel?
hear you. Yes, we can hear you. Please move on.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, you know, in other parts of the country, as had been mentioned already, in other parts of the world, governments, when they rolled out the stimulus packages, most of it were done into the account of the citizens, and the citizens were able to access their bank account with the ATM cards or with their credit cards or with their debit cards, and they were able to purchase items online and to be delivered to them directly in their homes, etc., etc. In our part of the world, that was not the case. So stimulus packages in Africa mainly had to do with handouts, that monies were supposed to be delivered physically to the citizens, and food was supposed to be delivered physically to citizens. That meant that a lot of those who were already excluded from the financial system, who did not have access to technological products such as ATM cards and debit card and credit card, could not access these. Government could not send these monies or these stimulus packages through their account because they were excluded. And of course, government needs to be accountable to the people, and therefore government to people that will not have records about it, and so on and so forth. So the victims of modern slavery and human trafficking, who were already vulnerable and who, by nature of their vulnerability, were not able to access some of these technological facilities, were further made vulnerable by this, pandemic, which made them unable to access a lot of stimulus packages. And of course, once this is an organized crime, victims became even more vulnerable because the who were supposed to provide protection for them and who were supposed to be able to address their issues could not do so because of the restrictions. And so victims who were already vulnerable with their traffickers had to stay with their traffickers as long as the restrictions lasted. We also know that a lot of businesses closed down, and already survivors of human trafficking most of them had no job, and once businesses closed down, then they were going to face more vulnerability as far as COVID impact was concerned. But more importantly, I know that globally, once you have access to banking and once you have access to some technological platforms such as money, mobile money, and so on and so forth, then you can sit in the comfort of your home and do this. But here's the case: you are looking at a group of people who do not have mobile phones, who do not have identification cards, and those who do not have any service, because as you know, most of these survivors live or are from vulnerable communities and are from poor communities, and therefore they live from hand to mouth. They don't have savings, and they don't have some of these platforms that we are talking about. And therefore, once the lockdown was announced, they instantly became very, very extremely vulnerable. In Ghana here, as my organization did, we had to work with our partners to be able to access some grants and be able to give some physical cash grant to survivors of human trafficking and their families, so that they will be able to live on. But you're talking about thousands who needed help, but who could not access help because of the particular nature of their vulnerabilities. So a lot of traffickers ended up acting on behalf of their victims or acting on behalf of survivors, because they are the ones that they know, and they are the ones who hold ID cards and who have access to bank accounts and who have access to technological platforms. Even in the government stimulus package that was sent to them, still you find some traffickers going to take the packages on behalf of survivors, thereby further impoverishing them and further making them vulnerable. The issue of human trafficking and its aggravation in the face of the COVID pandemic, it needs to be addressed holistically and sustainably. And I believe that it is partnership that will ensure I will do my part, you do your part, government will do its part, but we would have to all get the parts together in order that survivors will be protected and will get justice for what they are going through. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, James, for again sharing this important perspective from the Global South to the conversation we're having. I mean, we have been speaking about the effects COVID-19 had, but hearing it from you and in the local context, it makes it even more shocking. It also shows again how important access to basic financial services is essential to protect vulnerable populations, but also how challenging this can be, especially among poor populations. We continue to work with you, James. I hope we can continue to work with you and other survivors, which is a fundamentally important component of the FAST initiatives, and we are very privileged to have your views and your insight, which is very much actually driving our agenda. Let me just remind everyone that we have a Q&A functionality here, so please submit your questions before we move on to the next intervention and during the next intervention, because the next part will be the Q&A part. I'm sure you have some questions. You can either direct them to one panelist or just to all of us, and then we will see who can provide the answer. But last but certainly not least, I now have the pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Carlos Ruiz Gonzalez. He is Ambassador at Large for Human Trafficking and also Deputy Director General for International Cooperation Against Terrorism, Drugs and Organized Crime of the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As you have heard from the introductory remarks, Spain is very committed to combat modern slavery and human trafficking, also by mobilizing finance. Carlos, great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here with you from Madrid. Your Excellence, Permanent Representative, dear colleagues, experts on human trafficking. I first of all would like to thank the UNU Center for Policy Research and precisely the FAST initiative for your kind invitation to participate as a panelist in this side event. After the political commitment to fight modern slavery and human trafficking assumed by the ministers of Spain and Liechtenstein, former minister of Spain, because as you said it before, Daniel, there was a reshuffle last Saturday. Well, and all the highly interesting contributions of my fellow panelists, I am absolutely positive that practical conclusions will be drawn from this interesting event. As my former minister pointed out, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the rise of modern slavery and human trafficking already gave cause for concern. While we all heard that the 2016 estimate that a staggering 40 million people were trapped in modern slavery, and various indicators pointed to a surge in these forms of exploitation over the last decade. But then COVID pandemic came, and poverty and unemployment left millions of people across the world in a deeply vulnerable state. Marginalized populations felt the economic impact of the pandemic the hardest, which disproportionately affected women and girls, while child labor continued to scale. The ILO report mentioned before by my minister predicts that approximately 9 million more children could be forced into child labor by the end of 2022 due to the pandemic. And these figures are often hard to put into perspective, but that would be the equivalent to the 8th most populous country in the world. In addition to the lack of social and economic opportunities during the pandemic, the disruption to assistance and anti-slavery programming, together with the expanded use of technology for exploitation and enticement and a more limited law enforcement capacity in many countries, have had a cascading effect on vulnerability to these forms of exploitation. Criminal groups, including human trafficking networks, prey on those most vulnerable during a humanitarian crisis. And in that sense, the COVID-19 pandemic has been no exception. Some human rights organizations saw a 185% increase in the number of reports of trafficking these days. Nevertheless, and as you have heard during the minister's intervention, this grim picture has come with a growing recognition of the action needed to address modern slavery and human trafficking, as some of my fellow panelists have also outlined before me. The existence of modern slavery and human trafficking in supply chains means that some businesses compete on an uneven playing field. So the financial sector in particular has an important role to play in supporting good faith business actors. This is the reason why the Liechtenstein initiative is so important, because it can put together people and institutions from both the private and the public sectors, meaning regulators, financial institutions, victims and survivors, political leaders, or civil society organizations, to build on new ideas and good practices that all the stakeholders can put into real practice afterwards. We are all aware that financial institutions do come in touch with modern slavery and human trafficking generated funds, since traffickers want to transform those illegal revenues into legal ones. On the other hand, financial institutions may provide services of funds to companies or people associated to those crimes. The question is whether the financial sector is doing all it can and must to comply with all international and domestic legislation to counter modern slavery and human trafficking. Are they truly trying? It's a fact that during the pandemic, all the investors' eyes have been on social risk in environmental, social, and governance criteria, and ESG investing continues to grow with sustainable finance strategies that incorporate labor exploitation risks. In addition, asset managers around the world have come together to work in collaboration with businesses to rid value chains of modern slavery. Never has the S in ESG had as much attention as it does today, as Fiona noted previously. Financial investigation, aided by advances in financial technology, are further strengthening indicators of illicit financial flows of these forms of exploitation to detect and disrupt criminal networks. Moreover, regulators are further strengthening anti-money laundering and corporate reporting requirements. New developed indicators and toolkits, thanks to extensive bank data analysis, will largely improve the identification of those risks, although its effectiveness remains to be proved. That is why many experts indicate that taking into account survivors' experiences could be very useful in helping financial institutions identify where and how they might interact with potential businesses. Our dear friend and expert James Cockney explained this issue very clearly in a fast briefing paper in 2018. And I mention this because I believe that the interaction among financial institutions, public sectors, and survivors should be strengthened, not only from a prevention, but also from a compensation point of view. Moreover, not only the private sector is strengthening its instruments in order to detect and eradicate modern slavery and human trafficking practices from its portfolio, but also governments throughout the world are trying to increase the transparency legislation, creating due diligence frameworks in order to better struggle against human trafficking. Recognizing the grave personal and societal damage that modern slavery and human trafficking cause, governments are also increasingly coming together with the private sector to take multilateral collective action, as laid out 10 years ago in the UN Guiding Principle on Businesses and Human Rights. And the FAST initiative is a testament to that, and it is the reason why Spain is increasingly committed with it. We know that no one can end modern slavery and human trafficking on their own. Therefore, it is essential that we collaborate to find solutions that work, especially those that support survivors and those groups most vulnerable to exploitation. The COVID-19 crisis has exposed the fragilities in global supply chains and its tangible human costs. The pandemic has also given us all an opportunity to identify and implement the strategies to create systems that are more resilient for the future. Now is a crucial time to lay the foundations of a more global, inclusive economy to meet our shared objectives of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen from Madrid. I think these discussions and your attentions are very grateful from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Also, by giving this discussion a positive note, by clearly admitting the challenges that we are facing, but also identifying opportunities in that situation. And certainly resilience is probably the key word that should come to our mind. And we have to rethink the way we have done work in the past and move on in that regard. Thank you so much, Carlos, also for being with us here and supporting our work. We move on to the questions and answers round now, and I'm very happy to see that we have received a number of questions. Let me start with Andrew Dalip's question. He says that any access to financial services by the vulnerable populations is a tool to safeguard against human trafficking and modern slavery. And he was wondering, how does the panel anticipate international standards on financial inclusion to evolve in response to this issue? And I was wondering, Dawn, if I could start with you. You are part of the group that creates and implements international standards, whether you would like to elaborate on this question.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Andrew, for the question. Yes, it's definitely important for everyone to change the way we do business and the way we address things. And the FATF, of course, has recognized that there are somewhat unintended consequences, as they say, and there's an ongoing project in terms of looking at the impact that the FATF recommendations have on aspects such as financial exclusion, the risking, which is another side of the coin, depends on which angle you look at it, and some of the other measures that they put in place and how they can address those in a manner that allows, of course, everyone to improve the AML, CFT, CPF frameworks, but at the same point in time, give credence to the fact that there are some negative fallout that can be harmful to countries. So I think that that is going to play an important part in how we look at this. Human trafficking and is high on the agenda in terms of a predicate offense for the FATF. They have a recent paper that was done in 2018. There's ongoing work, even at the CFATF level. We are looking at financial flows from human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. It's a growing problem, again, because of COVID-19, shifting populations, people trying to go from where things are bad to where they hope they're better, whether they're being lured legitimately or not. So certainly it is a matter that is being looked at and something that has to be focused on, not only by the FATF, but by everyone, financial institutions, in terms of finding ways so that further populations, further amounts of people, larger amounts of people are not excluded because of the financial situation and because of COVID. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks a lot, Dawn. And yes, indeed. I mean, first and foremost, we have to ensure that existing international standards do not impact negatively on financial inclusion. And the work of the FATF is very welcome. I think the German presidency should also be commended for having started that work. I think for a long time it was a difficult conversation that we were having, and I think this analysis will help us to move on. Whether or not from that point on international standards will evolve to ensure financial inclusion remains to be seen. We have seen a lot in the European Union happening with mandatory access to basic financial services, which is good. Whether this will then be expanded to other parts of the region remains to be seen. Certainly, if we do that, we have to be very mindful of different circumstances, and what works in the north and in the west doesn't necessarily work in the global south. So we have to be mindful of what we do and where. There's been a question directly addressed to Fiona, so I hope I don't put you on the spot, but you may have seen it already. And the question is, would you have inputs on how to best educate the financial sector actors on investing good attention and resources to the S in ESG? Fiona, do you want to contribute to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think in terms of good resources on the S issues, there's quite a lot on the PRI website that we have for investors in thinking about social issues more broadly, whether that's to do with issues like human rights. We've got a paper that's there, and how investors can start incorporating these issues. Then we have them on a range of other social topics. And we've also got papers there that try to think about issues in a more holistic way. So even when we think about climate change, we still have to think about the social issues to do with climate. And there's quite a lot of social issues, both in developed and developed countries. And we have to take people along with us. So our website's www.unpri.org. And yeah, there's plenty of resources that are there, and they're all free to access as well.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Also on the FAST Initiative website, fastinitiative.org, you'll find useful information, including tools how to implement the goals. The first question, Charity Morsi asks, how do we provide incentives to the private sector? And I was wondering, James, you had your hand up, if you could speak on to this point.
Well, yes, briefly, I think that the FAST initiative is already doing something to incentivize the financial sector to be proactive and to take action. The recent financial inclusion initiative that has many financial sector actors on it is making some financial sector organizations look in the eyes of their investors and in the eyes of their customers. So as more people enroll on it, they do so believing that apart from they addressing social issues, they are also doing so for their investors to know that they are taking action, in their communities and in their society. Also, you will see that the FAST initiative has developed a lot of tools, financial risk mapping tools, that there are some different levels of financial institutions and their levels of response to some of these risk issues. There are some who take risk as just a risk of lending and the potential of defaulting, or the risk of money laundering, and so on and so forth. But they do not take risk as a social issue, right issues in their lending practices, and so on and so forth. And to give them these basic tools for these financial institutions to use, then gives them facilitate or at least encourage them to start something. And once they go in there, they will be able to then build on what FAST initiative has provided, and then they can do more sophisticated risk tools that will follow the money and to know where the risks are. So these are two basic incentives that I believe that the FAST initiative is providing within the sector. Of course, there's more we are doing in order to incentivize these sectors. And as time goes, I'm sure we'll continue to roll out our actions and we'll get more people on board.
Thanks a lot, James. I mean, this question on incentives for the private sector is a good one. It's also a bit a sad one, I must say. I mean, we're speaking here about ending one of the most atrocious crimes, and what could be a better incentive than contributing to ending this crime? But it's true, and we have seen another way of incentivizing private sector engagement was in the context of our Survivor Inclusion Initiative. If you need more information on that, please consult our website. But basically, in the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, we work both with support organizations as well as with financial institutions to help victims and survivors of the crime to get basic financial services, access to basic financial services. And we do showcase that. And very often financial institutions use their engagement in this initiative to make reference to it in their modern slavery statement. So that may also be seen as an incentive for financial institutions to participate. Finally, there was a question from an anonymous participant wondering about mandatory human rights due diligence reporting requirements. And the question is relatively simple and straightforward. Do we think they are doing enough? And what would you want to see states including the mandatory human rights due diligence requirements to make them more effective? Again, maybe Fiona, do you want to kick off on that? And of course, others then are more than happy to complement.
Sure. Well, obviously, because of the state of modern slavery and human trafficking around the world, we can't say that anybody is doing enough. And mandatory human rights due diligence is needed across the world. And I think it has to be really the fundamental that everyone has to report. We have to, I think the flip side of that is that we have to also be careful about some of the reporting about modern slavery and human trafficking, whether that's in the Modern Slavery Acts or whatever it might be. Because what we actually want is we want companies to find modern slavery, and we want them to report it, because once you've found it and you've reported it, you need to do something about it. And part of what we also need is to know, now that you've found something, what have you done about it? But there can be a situation where people try to. What I think I might have dropped out. Have I dropped out?
No, you're good. We can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Something came up on my screen and everyone disappeared. So we can have a situation where, of course, companies, investors are finding situation of modern slavery and human trafficking, and then they're plastered all over the front page of every newspaper as being this being a terrible thing, which of course it is. But we need to actually celebrate the fact that they found it and that they're doing something about it, because from the work that we have done, we don't really believe that there's many multinational organisations out there that actually don't have some form of modern slavery and human trafficking in them. And I think the other issue is how far and deep do they go into their supply chains? So it's pretty easy to say, oh well, who's the first line of my outsourcing, and who do I outsource to? And just stop there. But we all know that there's outsourcing on outsourcing on outsourcing on outsourcing. So you really need to go down into quite a bit of depth on these issues and in those supply chains as well. So I'll let you add, sorry, Daniel, to that.
Oh, thanks a lot. Very thoughtful. Like you, I'm far more concerned about companies, large companies that have never ever identified a link to modern slavery, human trafficking. I mean, given
Yeah, they say they don't have any.
exactly, and given the size of the problem, that's basically impossible. That means that turning a blind eye on it, and that would be a shame indeed. And I think we have seen very often in the context of anti-money laundering that the financial institutions that have seen wrongdoing and have seen deficiencies are actually now improving their systems. So there's nothing wrong to detect linkages to modern slavery and human trafficking as long as you're committed to do something about it. And that's something we certainly want to support also from our side. Good, thank you very much so far. I'm now very happy to pass the floor to His Excellency Mitch Fifield, Permanent Representative of Australia to the United Nations. Australia has been supporting FAST since its inception a few years ago, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been a co-convener of the Financial Sector Commission. Your Excellencies, thanking for your presence. The floor is now yours.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. And I know it's been a very busy day for you on a range of subjects, but great contributions. And can I firstly pass on the apologies of our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister for Women, Senator Maurice Payne, who unfortunately wasn't able to take part in today's proceedings, but who follows these matters very, very closely. And I've got to say, it's been a real pleasure to hear such a terrific discussion. Thank you so much to all the panelists. And I think what we would say in Australia is that this has been an absolutely cracking panel. So thank you so much, everyone. As has been so well highlighted by our panelists today, the finance sector plays such an important role in addressing human trafficking and modern slavery. The sector, we all know, is integral to business operations. So any changes that financial actors make in their investment decisions or how they deliver financial services can have a very considerable impact on other industries. And that's why, for our part, Australia, together with Liechtenstein and the Netherlands, co-convened the Financial Sector Commission on modern slavery and human trafficking, and why we continue to be a leading supporter of the FAST initiative. In the last few years, Australia has been working to socialise the Commission's recommendations across the Indo-Pacific region, and we really have seen some very good success. In September last year, for example, the Bali Process Government and Business Forum, co-chaired by Australia and Indonesia, convened a session focusing on the finance sector. That session highlighted the considerable work already being done by many parts of the diverse sector, including investors, stock exchanges, and pension funds as well. And in April, Minister Payne co-convened with her Spanish counterpart a meeting of women foreign ministers to discuss the gender implications of the COVID pandemic, with a special focus on the vulnerability of women and girls to trafficking. At the meeting, ministers endorsed the recommendations of the Blueprint report and discussed implementation in their respective regions. Ministers also discussed the importance of taking a victim-centred approach to make sure that victims and survivors are supported and that their experience really does inform our responses to modern slavery. We're pleased to see such a high level commitment to the Blueprint, but as we've heard today, COVID does continue to challenge us in our efforts, and addressing the impacts of the pandemic will require a response that's built together with business, civil society and international partners. And that's why the FAST initiative is just so important, and why Australia remains committed to working with the finance sector to address this issue. And thank you again so much to all colleagues for their great participation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. It's up to me now to thank all panelists today, Dawn, Fiona, James, Carlos, for joining us here, spending your precious time with us. Thanks to all our donors and partners of the FAST initiative, particularly to the Liechtenstein mission here in New York, Christian Beneveser and Sina Alavi for setting up this panel, and my dear colleague Anthony Dorsey at CPR, who is our wizard of Zoom, who has helped us in the back to make us all come together here and that everything works very nicely on a technical level. I wish you all a very good day, and I'm looking very much forward to seeing you and hearing from you again at the next opportunity. Have a good day.